Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about a topic that's kind of new to me, but not really new to me. But I wanted to put out some ideas about this one, and that's the notion of science fantasy and science fiction. Now, the notion of science fiction is pretty well known and established, but I've only kind of like really learned about science fantasy. Not so much that I'm learning about the genre for the first time. I'm just learning that that's what a lot of people were calling it for the most part. And I really like this because I've turns out I've always been a fan of science fantasy, not so much science fiction. We'll talk a little bit about those. Science fantasy is well, it's fantasy in sort of a science fictiony setting, whereas science fiction is very much hardcore science fiction. Kind of depends on how hardcore you want to get. So I'm kind of putting things in like two broad categories. So with science fantasy, that is really probably the older version of science fiction. When we think of like the oldest science fiction stories out there, they're probably really more science fantasy. Because science, of course, as we are sort of define it or think about it, is a fairly modern convention, fairly modern invention. Not exactly certain when we sort of codified the scientific method, and of course, we're always learning new and different things about the universe and how it works. So, what is science fact today was science fiction at one point, and then science fantasy at another point. One of the earliest books that I at least thought of when I thought about this of science fantasy was Frankenstein, which is sometimes called like the first science fiction or whatever. And I don't really think that's an accurate label. And of course, Frankenstein's usually put in with horror, but at least when I read it, I didn't really think it was all that scary. I think the movies tried to make it more scary, but the book itself wasn't really as scary. At least maybe not as we think of horror today. But so a little known fact, because most people are familiar with Frankenstein from the movies and this whole character concept and that sort of thing. But Mary Shelley, when she wrote Frankenstein, she really didn't describe how the monster was made. Um, if I remember right, it's been a while since I read it. It's really kind of like just a paragraph of the doctor, Victor Frankenstein, describing the process by which he made it. And I think it was in some little room that he sort of like tucked away in some university. And he just sort of does some really hand wavy description of, using, alchemy and dark arts and that sort of thing. And then the creature starts to wake up. He freaks out and he runs out of the room. He's so disgusted by what he created that he just leaves and leaves it behind, and that's that. And so Frankenstein is sort of like the classic example of a scientist being so hyper focused on can he do a thing that he never really stops to wonder, should I do this thing? The atomic bomb is a good example. Cloning and gene therapies are these other kind of classic examples of we get hyper focused on can we do this thing that no one ever really stops to think, should we do this thing? But that's the reason why I label it as more science fantasy, is because she never really explains like how the creature is made, because it doesn't matter. And I think that's the biggest part with science fantasy is the how doesn't really matter. It's just a vehicle for the story. Whereas in science fiction, a lot of people like science fiction to be very rooted in the how, especially more modern science fiction. They want to know how does this work, and if it doesn't seem like it would work, they'll call you out on it. They'll call you out on that bullshit. Um, Probably the two best examples of science fantasy versus science fiction is Star Wars versus Star Trek. And I think that's one of the reasons why there are some people who are diehard Star Wars fans or diehard Star Trek fans, or people who like both, but for very, very different reasons, because they are really into different genres. Star Wars is science fantasy, leaning a little more towards science fantasy. Because most of the stuff that happens in Star Wars isn't really explained, nor is it really important. Like, what is a blaster? How does it work? Why does it shoot out like a little bolt of light instead of like a continuous stream? Can you run out of shots? I don't remember ever seeing Han Solo needing to reload. None of the stormtroopers, while they're firing all these shots that continually miss the heroes, they never seem to stop the need to reload or anything else like that. How a lightsaber, for instance, it really shouldn't work. It's a beam of light that stops. But light doesn't do that. Light just keeps going until it hits something. So if the lightsaber was like this beam of light that just sort of like chopped through everything, and it just sort of extended out from the handle until it hit something and then it cut through it, that would be more realistic. Of course, it'd be a stupid weapon because you would just destroy everything around you and kill everyone. Um, why does Chewbacca's blaster rifle look like a crossbow? What the hell are those two little ball things doing at the end of it? Who knows? And of course, the biggest example of science fantasy in Star Wars is the Force. That is the most mystical aspect of the Star Wars movies. And mind you, I'm coming at this from the movies. I know there's been a lot of books that have come out since then, and maybe those books explain this stuff a little bit more. But in general, if you're like me and you really only know the movies, because I was 7 years old when the first movie came out. I remember watching it. At no point did I care about any of that stuff. It was just this amazing story. And what I think is interesting is, well, let me get to the interesting bit in a little bit. Let me go to Star Trek. And Star Trek is very much science fiction. Now, it's still very far in the future, so it's far enough technology that we kind of have to hand wave a little bit because, warp drive, what exactly is it? Well, we kind of know what the theory is, and I believe NASA's actually even created a very small warp engine in the sense that it distorts space around it enough to where it compacts space in front of it and extends space behind it, and so it theoretically would move faster because it's actually not traversing this space, it's traversing this space. That's theoretically how warp drive works. See, I can explain warp drive because Star Trek tries to explain it. Now, exactly how it works, where dilithium crystals and where are they used for, we have to hand wave that sort of thing. There is a little bit of science fantasy thrown in there because it seems like every species, alien species that they come across, except for a very small few of them, they all speak English. Look at the Next Generation. They'll run across an alien species of a planet that's been hidden for thousands of years, and they're extremely xenophobic, but man, they speak perfectly good American English. Um, if I just drive 4 hours south of here, I'm in Mexico, and I may not meet anyone who speaks English. But Captain Picard can fly across the galaxy, and everybody speaks English. A little bit of hand wavy there, but the for the most part with Star Trek, they are trying to kind of explain a little bit of how a lot of these things work. What's interesting, this is the interesting part, is when you start bridging these two, that's when people start to really rebel. This is a big deal in Star Wars. One of the things that a lot of people liked about Star Wars was the Force. They liked this mystical aspect. They liked that there's a philosophical, almost religious aspect to the Star Wars world, which was very different than what most science fiction is doing because it's science fantasy. But then, like, remember what the Phantom Menace, what was one of the things that Qui-Gon does is he measures this kid's midi-chlorian count. People hated that. I didn't like it either. To be honest, the prequel movies turned me off from Star Wars. I was such a huge fan of Star Wars. It was such a big part of me growing up that once they kind of went down that road, I just didn't really care anymore. It was didn't fit right. And I don't, if I remember right, he kind of dropped the midi-chlorian things. I don't really think it becomes a thing in the Phantom Menace or not the Phantom Menace, the Attack of the Clones or that third movie, which I can't remember because I didn't really like the prequels. Um, and then they did it again in one of the newer movies, one of the Disney sequels, which I didn't like those either. So I'm kind of a old school. I like my Star Wars from the 70s and the 80s. Thank you very much. But I do remember from a lot of people complaining who made the reviews that all of a sudden ships need fuel. Because if I remember right, that was one of the plot devices, is the Rebel Alliance is on the run from the not the New Order, the First Order, yeah. New Order is the 80s band, very good 80s band. But the First Order, and they're running out of fuel because they keep having to like do hyper jumps. And if I remember right, people were complaining. I think they even said like even in the books, fuel is not something you talk about. It is talked about in Star Trek. You have a certain amount of dilithium crystals, and if they run out, then yeah, you have to get more, and that's been a plot point for certain Star Trek shows. I think that was a big deal, if I remember right, with Voyager, because they were trying to make this long trip back across the galaxy, and eventually they were starting to have problems with that. Again, Star Trek, fuel, engines, we don't know exactly how they work, but we kind of assume they're like an engine in a car. When I can only drive so far before I run out of gas. That has never been a concept in Star Wars, because it's science fantasy. Ships go because they go. They go however fast they need to because that's how the story works. And I don't know if it, even with Star Trek, I don't know if they've ever crossed the line in this fantasy except for, maybe the language thing, and that's just because nobody wants to watch a movie where every show starts with them. What are they saying? What are they saying? Now, notice they did fix that with the Star Trek Enterprise, that they had to take a person with them who is a linguist. And she had to try and figure out how to speak people. And then they kind of did the hand wavy thing of like, oh, there's this computer that just magically knows how to translate everything. Again, a little more science fantasy, but they tried to address it in a scientific way. But I think in general, if they tried to go down too much of a science fantasy route with Star Trek, you would see a lot of Star Trek people rebelling because that's not why you do it. And in the all the genres of books and stuff, it's that same sort of thing. I like science fantasy mainly because I like fantasy in general. I like reading it, and I also like writing it as well. To the point of like, I don't even want my fantasy to start to become too sciencey, right? When you start going down the road of practicing magic, that anyone can do it. If you read the words the right way and you wave your wand the right way, then anyone can cast spells. Then your magic is really just technology, and it's really just more science fiction. And it's science fiction where people also carry swords, but it starts to get watered down a little bit. Dune is an interesting crossover, I think. It's science fiction, but it's also got a lot of science fantasy to it. There's an explanation for how space travel happens. It's the navigators. They eat the spice. And that somehow mutates their mind, mutates their body through lots of other training and stuff. They're somehow able to fold space. See, there's a little bit of an explanation there, but the explanation is just kind of off, that it's a little harder to kind of go down the science fiction route, like Star Trek, where you have engines and fuel and that sort of stuff. The mentats, how does eating the spice make them more mentally fast and stuff? Well, we can kind of, if you're doing work with psychedelics and shrooms and stuff, you can kind of like, oh, okay, well, that kind of makes sense. I can kind of see that. But yeah, Dune is interesting. And also Dune is interesting too because it takes the science fantasy route of, yeah, we have these things, we have this technology. This is kind of how it works, but who gives a shit? Let's talk about the political machinations of the galaxy, because that's really more what Dune is about, is about these feudalistic families, and then there's just sort of the Messiah thing. So again, we get a lot more of the spirituality, and that's really more of the focus of the books, and that's why I'd call Dune more in the science fantasy realm of things. But yeah, as far as what I like to write, what I like to read, I like the science fantasy stuff. I don't want to get too into the weeds of like how things work and why they work. I have like a general framework in my head. This is talking more about my stories, my books, of how things work. I will probably never really explain it. Certainly not in my writing. Maybe if I'm ever interviewed by somebody, they want to know all the details of the stuff. But to me, that's not really the important part. That's not really the interesting part. And I don't want to hyper focus and start restricting my writing based upon these rules that I've sort of laid out. I kind of like keeping it interesting. I also like the mystery too. There's a little bit of that. Think about Lost. The TV show. It was science fantasy. What I thought was interesting is it was science fantasy with the world trying to make it science fiction. They were trying to understand it, even though the island was really something kind of understandable, misunderstandable, whatever, incomprehensible. That's a much better word. And then just sort of fell apart at the end because they didn't really have a plan. They didn't really know what they were doing. They didn't have really a framework in their own head. They just kind of went with whatever's cool, we'll stick it on there, and then eventually they tried to make sense of it. X-Files was like that as well, but that's a whole other debate. But anyway, I hope you liked this discussion on science fiction, science fantasy. If you want to see some more examples of science fantasy, I of course would recommend my reading. My book, my first novel, The Saga of the Scout, is a post-apocalyptic science fantasy story. And I'm working on the sequel. I'll probably work on some short stories as well, but that'll probably be more for a little more like Sword and Sorcery. Sword and Sorcery is a good way of doing science fantasy if you like John Carter of Mars and that sort of thing. That's also probably science fantasy. But anyway, I hope to see you again, and all the links to my books, my website are all down below. If you join my mailing list, then you will see you'll get a free short story based on Yark, my Yark the Scholar, my original character, more of a Indiana Jones meets Conan the Barbarian. But anyway, I'll talk to you later.